She was 51 years old, and she had exactly $4.30 left in the world. Her name was Maren Ohlsdorf, and in the spring of 1903, the Consolidated Cattlemen's Trust of Harlan County, Nebraska had taken nearly everything she owned. The house her husband had built with his own hands, the 43 acres of bottomland they had worked together for 2 decades, and every head of cattle bearing their brand. They had done it legally, paper by paper, in a courthouse that smelled of pipe tobacco and linseed oil. Before a judge who had twice eaten supper at her table and said nothing while the documents were signed. The reason they gave was debt. The reason that was true was that her husband, Conrad, had died of a chest fever 14 months prior, and she had refused, politely, then firmly. Then in writing, to sell her water rights to the trust at the price they named, which was no price at all. With what remained after the court's accounting, she walked to the far end of the Millhaven rail yard, where the stationmaster, a tired man named Deke Purcell, was selling off what the railroad called encumbered assets. Among them, one old freight car, rusted shut at every seam, the locking bars so corroded that no one in the yard had been able to break it loose in living memory. The car had sat on a siding since at least the 1860s. The stationmaster sold it to Maren Ohlsdorf for $3, and he warned her twice that she was wasting her money, and she paid him without a word. She did not know, then, what was inside. Nobody did. But something was sealed in that car, something that had been hidden from the town of Millhaven, Nebraska for 40 years, and when it finally came to light, it would not only restore what had been stolen from Maren. It would give back to the people of that valley something they had believed was gone forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Maren Ohlsdorf. If you are watching from a place that feels like it has been picked clean and left behind, we want you to know, tell us in the comments. You are not watching alone. Her father, Lars Ohlsdorf, had come to Nebraska from Schleswig-Holstein in 1858 with a wooden trunk, $40 in silver, and the conviction that the American plains were, at their heart, a kind of promise. He was not a soft man. He had worked his passage on a grain ship, then worked his way west behind other men's plows until he could afford one of his own. He believed in honesty the way some men believe in religion, not merely as a moral code but as a structural principle, the load-bearing beam of a life. He said once, when Maren was young enough to be sitting on the fence rail watching him mend harness, "A man who cheats the scale today will cheat the sky tomorrow. And neither the scale nor the sky forgets." Maren had been the third of his 5 children, the one who watched most carefully, the one who asked the most questions, and the one he answered most directly. As though he recognized in her something that needed to be spoken to straight. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's broad hands, and she could read a land survey plat before she could braid her own hair. Lars had taught her that. He believed women who understood land were harder to swindle than women who did not, and he had seen enough women swindled to have formed a strong opinion on the subject. She had also learned, from him, the keeping of accounts. Not the mere tallying of sums, but the deep craft of ledger work, the understanding that a number written down with precision was a form of witness. That records honestly kept were a kind of testimony, that a person who could show you the paper trail of her life was a person who could defend it. Lars Ohlsdorf kept his ledgers in a small wooden box with a brass clasp, and he reviewed them every Sunday evening at the kitchen table. And Maren sat beside him and learned to read them like a language, which in a sense they were. She had married Conrad Ohlsdorf, no relation, though people in Millhaven smiled at the coincidence of the name, in the autumn of 1878, when she was 26. Conrad was a quiet, broad-shouldered man with a gift for working with animals and a temper so mild it sometimes frustrated her. Because she was the one who had to be sharp when sharpness was called for. He was the labor and she was the reckoning, and between them they had built a life on the bottomland outside of Millhaven that was, by any honest measure, a fine one. They had raised 2 children who lived and buried one who did not. They had paid their notes on time and kept their fences in good repair and sent money back to Lars when he grew too old to work, and when Lars died. Maren had been the one to go through his papers and make sure every account was closed clean. She had inherited from him, besides the practical knowledge of ledgers, the conviction that a record faithfully kept would eventually speak. She believed this with the same structural certainty her father had believed in honesty. She had no idea, in those years of peace, how much she would need that belief. She had no idea what was coming. Conrad had begun to cough in the winter of 1901. By the following spring the cough had settled deep in his chest and would not be dislodged. The doctor in Millhaven, a young man from Ohio who had set up his practice just 3 years prior, said it was the lungs, said it had likely come from the cold wet autumn they'd had. And prescribed rest and a tincture of something that smelled of camphor. Conrad rested as much as a man like him was capable of resting, which was not much, and by the autumn of 1902 he was gone. He died in the bedroom they had shared for 24 years, with Maren's hand in his, on a Wednesday morning so clear and cold the frost made lace on the windows. She had buried him and then turned to face the accounts. This was the only way she knew to honor him, to be clear-eyed about what remained, to make an honest inventory of what must be done. What she found, as she went through their papers, was that the trust had been quietly buying up the notes held against farms throughout the valley. Conrad had borrowed, modestly, during the hard years of the mid-1890s, most men in the valley had. The notes had originally been held by the Millhaven Savings Bank, and Maren had always dealt with the bank's president, a stout and fair man named Walter Cree, who had known her father. But Cree had retired 2 years prior, and the bank's notes had been sold in a portfolio, and that portfolio had been acquired by the Consolidated Cattlemen's Trust. And the trust was something else entirely. They sent their man to see her in December of 1902, 2 months after Conrad's burial. He was a smooth-faced man in a good coat named Aldous Prentice, and he sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and explained to her, with the patient courtesy of a man who has prepared for every possible response, that the trust was prepared to settle the note in exchange for the water rights along Maren's lower pasture, the rights that gave her creek access and also, incidentally, controlled the water supply for the 3 farms adjacent to hers. The price he named was $40. Maren had looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said that the water rights, independently assessed, were worth $1,200 at a minimum, and that she had that assessment in writing from a surveyor in Grand Island. And that she would not be selling them at $40. Prentice had nodded as though she'd said something he expected, finished his coffee, and left. What followed was 14 months of legal pressure that operated with the grinding slowness of a millstone and the same inevitable result. The trust had lawyers in Lincoln. Maren had her own paper, her own records, her own careful ledgers, but the judge who heard the case was a man who had known the trust's principal investors since before the county was incorporated. And the outcome, when it came, was written in the language of law but authored in the language of arrangement. The court found against her on a technicality of her original notes assignment clause, a clause so narrow and obscure that Maren's own attorney, a decent man named Gabe Hurst, told her afterward that he had never seen it applied in 20 years of practice. She had walked out of the Harlan County Courthouse into April sunshine that seemed to have nothing to do with her, with $4.30 and the clothes she was wearing. And she had stood on the courthouse steps and made herself breathe slowly, the way her father had taught her to breathe when the world turned mean. She was 51 years old. She had nowhere to go. The Millhaven rail yard sat at the eastern edge of town, where the land flattened out and smelled, on warm days, of oil and iron and the particular dusty sweetness of grain that had been loaded and unloaded for decades. Maren walked there because she had no other direction to walk. She had spent the night before on a cot in the back room of the Methodist church, whose minister, an elderly man named Reverend Clute, had offered it without asking questions. And she would not spend another night there if she could help it. She was not too proud to accept charity. She was too honest to accept it longer than necessary. Deke Purcell was standing outside his stationmaster's office with a sheaf of papers when she arrived. He was selling off what he called deadweight, equipment the railroad had written off its books and needed physically removed from the yard to make room for expanded switching operations coming that summer. There were several items on his list: a broken turntable mechanism, 2 wheels off a flat car, a quantity of used rail spike, and, at the very end of the siding, half hidden by a stand of volunteer cottonwoods, the freight car. It was a 40-foot boxcar, or had been once. It sat on a section of rail that connected to nothing on either end, a rail spur that had been abandoned when the yard's layout changed sometime in the 1870s. The car was painted, or had been painted, a dark red, though most of the paint had gone to rust. And the rust had gone to a kind of velvety brown that was almost beautiful in the morning light if you were disposed to look at things that way. The sliding door was locked from the outside by a bar mechanism, and the bar had corroded into its bracket so completely that it had become, Purcell explained, essentially structural. Nobody could say any more where the latch ended and the wall of the car began. 2 yard workers had tried bolt cutters the previous summer. One of them had tried a sledgehammer. The mechanism had not given. The railroad solution was to sell the car as a unit and let it become someone else's problem. The price was $3, which Purcell said almost apologetically, as though embarrassed to be charging anything for something so useless. Maren walked the length of the car without speaking. She put her hand flat against the rust and felt the faint give of old iron, not brittle, she noted, but tired, which was different. She crouched and looked at the undercarriage, which was sounder than the exterior suggested. She stood and looked at the locking bar, and she spent a long time looking at it, and Purcell shifted his weight from foot to foot and waited. She paid him $3. He gave her a bill of sale on railroad stationery, and she folded it carefully and put it in the same pocket where she kept what remained of her money. What she had noticed, looking at the locking bar, was this: the corrosion was deep and complete on the exposed surfaces, the surfaces that faced weather. But the underside of the bar, the surface that rested against the bracket, was a different color, not the same velvety rust but a darker, almost purplish stain. She had seen that stain before. Her father had shown it to her once, on a piece of old farm equipment. It was the color iron turned when it had been treated with linseed oil and then left sealed away from air for a very long time. The bar had not seized from weather. It had been packed, deliberately, with oil, sealed from the inside out, which meant that someone had, at some point, meant for it to be openable again. She went to the Millhaven Hardware and Sundries, which was owned by a man named von Grossbach who had gone to school with Conrad and who, when she explained her situation without self-pity and asked for credit, said nothing for a moment and then handed her a bottle of penetrating oil and a wrench with a 2-foot handle. She thanked him and told him she would repay him in 2 weeks. She meant it. She went back to the car and she worked the oil into every crevice of the bar mechanism for 2 hours in the afternoon sun. She let it sit overnight. She came back the next morning before the yard stirred and she applied the wrench to the bar with the slow, steady, patient pressure her father had taught her was the only pressure worth applying to things that didn't want to move. She did not jerk or force. She leaned her weight into the handle and she held it, and she counted, and at 143 she heard a sound like a held breath releasing, and the bar moved. It moved half an inch. Then, with another long slow application of pressure, another inch. Then, with a sound like tearing cloth, it swung free. The door did not open easily either. Its rollers had seized in their track, and she had to work a pry bar, borrowed from Purcell, who had stopped pretending he wasn't watching, along the door's bottom edge before it gave. When it did give, it gave all at once, rolling back with a sound like a groan, and the smell that came out of the car was the smell of old paper and cedar and something faintly chemical. Almost medicinal, and underneath all of it, the faint ghost of a smell she recognized from her father's house, ink. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The interior of the car was not empty. It was not remotely empty. It was stacked, floor to nearly ceiling, with wooden crates, perhaps 40 of them, of varying sizes, and between and around the crates, filling every remaining space, were stacks of paper. Ledgers. Bound in cloth and leather and paperboard, in every size from a small diary to a volume the width of her 2 hands together. Hundreds of them. Perhaps more than 100. She did not count them that morning. She stood at the door of the freight car she had paid $3 for, and she looked at what no one in Millhaven had seen for 40 years, and she understood. The way she understood figures in a ledger, that she was looking at something enormous. It took her 3 days to begin to understand what she had found, and another 2 weeks to understand it fully. And by the time she understood it fully she was sitting in Reverend Clute's front parlor with her hands folded on the table and a careful, contained expression on her face that people who knew her would have recognized as the expression she wore when she was holding something very large very quietly inside herself. The crates, when she opened them, contained the physical stock of a business, a printing business, specifically. There were blocks of movable type in lead and wood, there were rollers and frames for a small hand press, there were bottles of printer's ink long since dried to tar. There were reams of paper still in their original wrapping, slightly yellowed but intact. There were, in a flat cedar box sealed with a leather strap, the engraved copper plates for a newspaper. The nameplate on the plates read, "The Millhaven Valley Register, EST 1861. She knew that name. Everyone in Millhaven over the age of 40 knew that name. The Valley Register had been the county's first newspaper, founded by a man named August Preller in the early years of the town's life. It had published for perhaps a decade. Maren's earliest childhood memories included her father reading it aloud at the table on Saturday mornings, and then it had stopped, suddenly. In the way things in those years sometimes simply stopped. The official story, passed down in the way unofficial histories are passed down in small towns, was that Preller had folded the paper after a dispute with the county's leading men and left the territory. No one had preserved copies of the paper, or so it was believed. No one had seen Preller's equipment since the 1860s. Here was the equipment. All of it, apparently. Loaded onto a freight car on a siding and locked, and the key, she found the key eventually, a long iron skeleton key, hanging on a nail inside one of the crates. Wrapped in an oilcloth the same way her father wrapped his tools, left behind for whoever came. The ledgers were not the paper's business records. They were something else. Maren sat in the freight car through 3 evenings with a lantern and read, beginning to understand page by page what August Preller had done in the last year of the register's life. And why he had hidden it so carefully, and why, she began to be certain of this, he had hidden it in such a way that it could be found. Preller had been keeping a parallel record. In addition to publishing the newspaper, which covered the ordinary life of the valley, crop prices, church socials, local elections, land transfers, he had been maintaining, in a series of private ledgers, a different kind of account. He was recording the financial arrangements of the valley's leading men, the land deals struck in private, the notes traded between the powerful at prices that bore no relationship to the public market, the water rights purchased at coercion's price from farmers who didn't yet understand what they were giving up, the quiet rearrangements by which a small group of men in Millhaven were, in the years after the war, systematically consolidating the valley's most valuable resources into their own hands. He had names. He had dates. He had figures. He had, in several cases, the actual documents, or copies of documents, made in the clear precise hand of a man who had been trained as a typesetter and understood the reproduction of text, that proved the arrangements he described. He had the names of the families who had been displaced. He had the original valuations of what they had lost. He had, in one case, a sworn affidavit from a farmer named Helmut Daister who had been told his water rights were worthless by a county assessor who, Preller's records showed, was also on the payroll of the valley's leading cattlemen. The leading cattleman of that era, this was 1863, 1864, 1865, was a man named Calhoun Aldrich. Aldrich was long dead. But his son, who had inherited the cattle operation, had merged it in 1891 with 2 other operations to form the Consolidated Cattlemen's Trust. The trust's current principal was a man named Harris Aldrich, Calhoun's grandson. The same Harris Aldrich who had sent Aldous Prentice to her kitchen table with an offer of $40 for water rights worth $1,200. She sat with that understanding in the lantern light of the old freight car, and she let it be as large as it was. Preller had known, she understood, that publishing this in the register would get him run out of the county, and likely hurt, and possibly worse. He had made the calculation that the newspaper could not survive what he knew, and so he had done the next best thing, he had preserved it. He had packed every record into this car, every document, every ledger, the very press that could print them, and he had locked it with a bar he treated to last, and he had left the key inside, visible to whoever opened the car with the patience and wit to find it. He had left, and he had apparently trusted that someday, someone would need what he had saved. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it meant to prepare a truth for a future you wouldn't live to see. She thought about her father, who had told her, a record faithfully kept will eventually speak. 40 years. It had taken 40 years. But here she sat. She did not move precipitously. That was the temptation she recognized and resisted, to carry Preller's ledgers directly to a judge or a newspaper editor, to show what she had and demand a reckoning. She had been to a judge. She had seen what that produced. She needed, first, to understand completely what she had, second, to find someone who could act on it, and third, to understand that whoever she brought this to would face the same pressures she had faced, the same weight of the trust's arrangements bearing down on anyone who moved against them. It was von Grossbach who told her, cautiously, that there was a new editor at the Kearney Morning Herald, a man named Oliver Swick who had come from a paper in Chicago and who had, in his first 6 months in Nebraska, published 3 pieces about railroad land fraud in the western counties that had drawn the attention of the state attorney general's office. Grossbach said this carefully, the way men say things they want to say without exactly saying them, and Maren understood him and thanked him. Before she could reach Swick, she encountered the first active resistance. It came in the form of Aldous Prentice, who appeared at the rail yard 3 days after she had opened the car. Having heard from someone, she never learned who, that she had found something interesting inside it. He did not threaten her directly. He was too smooth for that. He spoke about the railroad's property rights, about questions of what might constitute a lawful sale of contents versus the car itself. About the possibility that certain historical documents might be considered abandoned property reverting to the county. He spoke in the kind of legal language that was designed to make a person feel uncertain about what they owned and what they knew. She listened to all of it. Then she told him she had a bill of sale for the car, signed by the duly authorized stationmaster of the Millhaven rail yard. And that she had a lawyer. She said this with the same level certainty with which she might have said she had 2 hands, and that she looked forward to any conversation about ownership that he wished to have in a court of law. She said this last part with a particular calm that she had learned from her father, the calm that is not indifference but is rather the stillness of a person who knows exactly where they stand. Prentice left. But the next morning, 2 men she did not recognize appeared near the freight car, not doing anything, simply standing there. Which was a thing men sometimes did when they wanted you to understand that you were being watched. She had expected this. She had already, the previous evening, moved the most critical of Preller's ledgers to Reverend Clute's house, packed in a flour sack. And had asked Clute, who listened to her account of what she had found with the absolute stillness of a man hearing a confession he has half expected for many years, to hold them. Clute did not ask her many questions. He was old enough to remember August Preller. The harder resistance came from within the town, from people who were not employed by the trust but who had grown accustomed to its arrangements. There was the county clerk, a man named Leonard Sopp, who appeared at Maren's. She was now sleeping in the freight car itself, which she had cleaned with borrowed brooms and in which she had placed a cot, and told her that she was squatting on railroad property and would need to vacate. She showed him the bill of sale. He said the bill of sale might not cover residence. She said the bill of sale covered everything the railroad had intended to convey, and she would wait for his legal determination in writing. He did not produce one. There was a woman at the Methodist church, a deaconess named Cora Flinch, who told Reverend Clute that it was inappropriate to harbor a person of uncertain standing. By which she apparently meant a woman who had lost a property dispute and now lived in a freight car and was asking difficult questions about the Aldrich family. Clute told Cora Flinch, in the gentle and total way of old ministers, that he was unable to see what was inappropriate about it and that he would continue as he was. And there was, most persistently, the weight of the town's silence, the way people looked past her on the street, the way conversations quieted when she entered the hardware store. The way the small hostilities of a place protecting its arrangements manifested not as violence but as a kind of collectively held breath, awaiting for her to give up and go somewhere else. She had felt this before, during the trial. She recognized it. It was designed to make you feel alone, and she was not unaffected by it. There were evenings in the freight car when she sat with her hands folded on her knees and felt the aloneness press in from the walls, felt it as a physical thing, a cold pressure. What she did on those evenings was take out her father's ledger. She had kept it all these years. Through the farm and the children and the court and the $4 morning, and she looked at his handwriting, the careful firm figures, and she remembered him saying, "The scale and the sky do not forget." She believed him. She had to. Oliver Swick arrived in Millhaven on a Wednesday in early May, driving a rented buggy from the Kearney depot, and he was not what she had expected. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 35, with ink-stained fingers and the watchful eyes of a man who had spent years listening for what wasn't being said. He sat in the freight car on the cot she offered him and he read August Preller's ledgers for 4 hours straight. And when he set the last one down, his face was the face of a man who is trying to decide how much of what he feels to show. He said, "This is the most complete private record of systematic land fraud I have ever seen in 20 years of this work." She said, "I know." He said, "The Aldrich family will destroy both of us if we move on this without protection." She said, "What protection do you need?" He told her. He needed copies of the most critical documents, made and held in multiple locations. He needed affidavits from any surviving parties named in Preller's records or their descendants. He needed communication with the state attorney general's office, which he had contacts within. He needed time, perhaps 6 weeks, perhaps 8. She told him she had time. She had nothing but time. And she told him what else she had, which was the thing she had not yet told anyone but Clute. Among Preller's documents was a letter, in Preller's own hand, addressed to no one in particular, in which he described what he had done and why, and named the families he believed had been defrauded. And estimated, with the careful figures of a man who had been keeping accounts, the approximate value of what each family had lost. The letter was dated August 1863. It had been in that car for 40 years, waiting. She and Swick spent 6 weeks working. She had not worked this way since the hardest years on the farm, with the same focused expenditure of everything she had, the same knowledge that there was no reserve to draw on. Only the task directly in front of her. She made copies in her own handwriting, the clear, precise handwriting her father had taught her, of Preller's most critical pages. She found, through Reverend Clute's network of Methodist ministers in the surrounding counties, 3 families named in Preller's records who still had surviving members. She found the widow of Helmut Daister's son, a woman named Rosa, who wept when Maren read her father-in-law's affidavit aloud and then straightened her back and asked what she could do. Swick published the first piece in the Kearney Morning Herald in late May. It was careful and specific and named no names without documentation. And it was accompanied by the state attorney general's announcement that his office had opened an investigation into land acquisition practices in Harlan and surrounding counties over the previous 4 decades. The Herald's piece was reprinted in the Omaha newspapers within a week. The trust's lawyers came. They were, as Swick had predicted, formidable. They questioned the provenance of Preller's documents. They questioned whether documents found in a privately purchased freight car were admissible as anything. They questioned whether a woman who had just lost a property dispute was a credible custodian of historical materials. They were smooth and unhurried and absolutely certain of their ground. The Attorney General's investigators were smoother and less hurried and more certain of theirs. They had subpoena power, which was different from having a good argument. They examined the original documents, not copies, and they brought in a specialist from the University of Nebraska who confirmed that the ledger's paper and ink were consistent with the 1860s. That the handwriting matched samples of Preller's typesetting notation held in a church archive in Kearney, and that there was no evidence of later alteration. The ledgers were what they appeared to be. Harris Aldridge, the trust's principal, did not go to prison. This is one of the truths of quiet justice: it does not always wear the shape people hope for. What happened to Harris Aldridge was this: the Attorney General's office found sufficient grounds to void, retroactively, 12 land transactions from the period covered by Preller's records. On the grounds of fraudulent inducement. The trust was assessed for the modern equivalent of what those original families had lost. The assessment was significant. The trust, which had been extended beyond its actual assets in anticipation of the water rights it had expected to absorb through the valley, was unable to meet it. By September of 1903, the Consolidated Cattlemen's Trust of Harlan County had been dissolved by its creditors, and Harris Aldridge had retreated to a smaller life in Omaha. And Aldous Prentice had resigned his position and was not heard from in Millhaven again. Maren's own property was addressed separately. Gabe Hurst, her attorney, filed a motion arguing that her case was directly implicated by the trust's fraudulent practices and that the original judgment against her should be reviewed. The review took 3 months and the result was partial. The court restored her water rights, which had been the thing the trust most wanted, and restored the acreage of the lower bottomland. It did not restore the house, which had already been sold to a third party, or all 43 acres, and Maren did not fight for what she could not recover. She accepted what came back to her with the same level-voiced dignity with which she had accepted what was taken, because rage and gratitude are both expensive when you have work to do. The families named in Preller's records received the assessed settlement funds. Rosa Daister, the widow Maren had found through Klute's network, used her share to pay off the note on the farm her family had worked as tenants for 2 generations. She wrote Maren a letter that Maren kept, folded, in the same pocket where she had kept her last $4.30 on the morning everything changed. August Preller's printing press was, at Maren's initiative and Swick's enthusiastic support, restored to working order by a printer from Grand Island who came out to the yard and spent 3 days cleaning and reassembling it. The lead type was melted down and recast where necessary. The copper nameplate was cleaned and polished. In October of 1903, the Millhaven Valley Register was re-established, with Oliver Swick as its editor and Maren Ohlsdorf as its keeper of accounts, a title she chose herself. The first issue ran 6 pages and printed 300 copies and included, on its front page, the full text of August Preller's letter from 1863, exactly as he had written it. Maren framed 1 copy of that front page and hung it in the register's office, which was established in a storefront on Millhaven's Main Street. She hung it next to a short account she wrote herself, in the plain and careful language she had learned from ledger keeping, of how the paper had been found. She did not frame anything about herself. She framed August Preller's letter, because it was his witness that had waited, and because she believed, as she always had, that a record faithfully kept would eventually speak. She walked the lower bottomland for the first time after its return on a morning in late September when the light was the color of old brass and the cottonwoods along the creek were letting go of their leaves 1 or 2 at a time. The land did not look as it had when she and Conrad had worked it. Land changes in 2 years of other people's management. But underneath the change it was the same clay-heavy soil that darkened when rain came, the same cant of the ground toward the creek. The same smell of grass and water and whatever it was the Nebraska earth smelled like in autumn that she had never been able to name precisely, had always simply called home. She stood by the creek for a long time. She was 51 years old, and she had come to the low point of her life and passed through it, and she was still standing, which was the only arithmetic that, in the end, mattered. She thought about her father, who had believed that honesty was a load-bearing beam. She thought about August Preller, who had believed it so completely that he had built a room around his testimony and locked it and left the key inside, trusting the future. She thought about Conrad, who had been the labor when she was the reckoning, and she felt his absence as a particular quality of the light. The way you feel the absence of something that was always present when it was there. She put her hand to the bark of a cottonwood tree. She breathed the autumn. Then she went back to town to keep the accounts. We began by telling you that Maren Ohlsdorf had $4.30 left in the world, and that she spent 3 of them on a locked freight car that nobody could open. And that what was inside had been hidden for 40 years. We told you it seemed desperate and foolish, the act of a woman with nothing left to lose. We want to return to that for a moment, because we think it was something else entirely. It was the act of a woman who looked at an old locked thing and saw, underneath the rust and the years and the collective assumption that nothing of value remained, a quality she recognized. Endurance. The bar had been packed with oil. Someone had sealed it to last. She saw that because she was the kind of person who looked at what others walked past, who read the underside of surfaces, who had learned from a father who kept honest accounts that the truth, once written down, does not simply go away. It waits. What August Preller had hidden was not merely a record of wrongs. It was an act of faith, faith that someday someone would come along who was curious enough, patient enough, and honest enough to crack open what he had preserved and do something useful with it. He could not have known who that person would be. He could not have known it would take 40 years. He sealed his testimony and trusted the future with it. The future sent Maren Ohlsdorf. She did not come with power or connections or legal leverage. She came with $4, a father's lessons, a wrench borrowed on credit. And the slow steady patience of a woman who had learned that things which do not want to move can be moved if you hold the pressure long enough and count. We think about that sometimes. We think about what it means to preserve a true thing for a time you can't see. We think about what it means to be the one who finds it. The Millhaven Valley Register published for 31 years after its restoration in 1903. Maren Ohlsdorf kept its accounts for 12 of those years, until her eyesight made fine figures difficult. The freight car remained in the rail yard. The railroad, in a gesture that Purcell said was the closest thing to sentiment he'd seen from the company in 20 years of service, declined to move it. It sat on its siding and the cottonwoods grew around it and it became, in the way of places where large things happened, a kind of landmark, a thing people pointed out to their children without always being able to say precisely why. Maren said, when people asked her what she thought about all of it, I think a $3 investment has a way of paying out if what's inside it has been honestly kept. She said it simply. She meant every word. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Maren, and with August Preller, who trusted the future enough to seal his truth in iron and oil and leave it for whoever came. Stories like this one remind us that the things most easily overlooked sometimes hold the most weight, that a locked and rusted thing in a forgotten corner of a rail yard can contain. If someone has the patience to open it, enough to restore what seemed irretrievably lost. If this story moved you or made you think of someone who deserved that kind of quiet justice, please share it. It costs nothing and travels far, and we believe the stories worth telling deserve that chance. We want to ask you one thing before you go, and we mean it sincerely. What is a time in your life when you found real value in something that everyone else had written off? It might be an object, or a place, or a person, or an idea. Tell us in the comments. We read them, and we think about them, and they matter to us more than we usually remember to say. Until next time, stay close.